Some people spend their entire lives waiting for a miracle. Mine arrived wearing soaked work boots and carrying 3 frightened puppies. The wind cut across the frozen river like broken glass, stealing every bit of warmth from the morning air. My scarf barely covered my face as I hurried across the narrow trail with a grocery bag in one hand and my daughter's favorite hot chocolate tucked beneath my arm. Winter had settled over our small town for weeks, wrapping everything in white silence. The lake beside the walking path had frozen almost completely, leaving only a narrow stretch of dark moving water beneath the old bridge where the current refused to surrender to the cold. I had walked this trail hundreds of times before work because it was the fastest way home after my early cleaning shift at the Riverside Inn. Every minute mattered when you were raising a 7-year-old alone. School started at 8. Breakfast needed to be ready before that. Laundry still waited in the apartment. Bills never stopped arriving. Life had taught me how to keep moving even when I was exhausted. Then I heard it. A tiny cry carried across the icy wind. At first I thought it was a bird trapped somewhere beneath the bridge, but the sound came again, desperate and frightened. I stopped walking. Listened carefully. 3 small whimpers echoed from the edge of the freezing water. My heart tightened. I climbed over the snow-covered guardrail and carefully made my way toward the riverbank, my boots slipping against the frozen ground. Nestled on a narrow patch of cracked ice were 3 tiny puppies huddled together, their soaked fur trembling as the freezing current crept closer with every passing second. Someone must have abandoned them. They were far too young to survive another hour in this weather. "It is okay," I whispered, even though they could not understand my words. "I am here." I lowered myself onto my knees, testing each step before moving forward. The ice groaned beneath my weight, but it held. One by one I gathered the puppies inside my winter coat, pressing them gently against my sweater to keep them warm. Their tiny bodies shook uncontrollably, yet each one leaned. Closer the moment it felt a little heat. I turned toward the riverbank, relieved that we had made it safely, when something farther downstream caught my eye. At first it looked like a fallen tree branch drifting near the edge of the water. Then the current shifted. A human hand appeared above the surface for the briefest moment before disappearing again. Every breath left my lungs at once. There was someone else out there. I looked down at the 3 puppies tucked safely inside my coat, then back toward the dark water. No emergency vehicles. No other hikers. No voices except the wind. My mind told me to run for help. My heart refused to leave. I carefully carried the puppies to the snowy bank and wrapped them inside my thick scarf before searching the shoreline for anything long enough to reach the struggling stranger. A fallen tree limb rested against the rocks a few yards away. I dragged it across the snow with trembling hands and crawled as close to the icy edge as I dared. The freezing water swirled around the motionless man, his dark coat heavy with ice, one arm barely visible above the surface. "Please," I whispered into the silent morning. "Just hold on a little longer." I stretched the branch toward him with everything I had, praying that hope could reach just a few inches farther than fear. The frozen branch trembled beneath my hands as I stretched every inch farther across the slippery riverbank. My gloves were soaked through, and I could no longer feel my fingers, but the man drifting in the icy current suddenly caught the end of the branch with surprising strength before losing his grip again. "Do not give up," I shouted, planting my boots deeper into the snow. "Please, just one more time." The current carried him only a few feet farther before the branch reached him again. This time his hand wrapped around it firmly enough for me to pull. Every muscle in my back screamed as I leaned away from the river, inch by inch dragging him closer until his heavy coat scraped against the frozen edge. He tried to help, but seemed too weak to stand. I grabbed the collar of his jacket with one hand and the branch with the other, pulling until he finally rolled safely onto solid ground. We both lay there breathing hard, staring at the pale winter sky while icy water soaked into our clothes. A few feet away, the 3 puppies whimpered softly from inside my scarf, reminding me that they were still alive. I crawled toward them first, wrapping them inside my coat once more before returning to the stranger. He was breathing, but barely. His lips had turned pale from the freezing water, and his dark hair clung to his forehead beneath a thin layer of melting ice. He looked to be in his late 30s, broad-shouldered even beneath the soaked coat, with weathered hands that suggested a lifetime of hard decisions rather than hard labor. A faded tattoo disappeared beneath the sleeve of his shirt when I carefully adjusted his arm into a more comfortable position. Whoever he was, he clearly did not belong alone beside a frozen river. My phone showed only one weak signal bar. Emergency services answered, but the dispatcher explained that road conditions had slowed every rescue unit already responding to weather-related calls across the county. They would come as quickly as possible, but it could take longer than usual. I looked around. The nearest farmhouse belonged to an elderly couple nearly half a mile away. The walk would take too long, and I could not leave him alone. All right, I whispered to myself. Then we are doing this together. I spread the emergency blanket I always kept inside my backpack across the snow and carefully covered the man before wrapping the puppies inside my thick winter coat against my chest. I rubbed his hands gently through the blanket, hoping to keep some warmth in them while speaking to him even though his eyes remained closed. You are safe now. Stay with me. Minutes passed slowly. Then I noticed the smallest movement. His eyelids fluttered open for only a second before focusing on me with quiet confusion. They were striking gray eyes, alert despite obvious exhaustion. He tried to speak, but no words came. I smiled with relief. Do not worry. Help is coming. His gaze shifted toward the puppies tucked safely inside my coat. One tiny golden puppy stretched its nose out from the folds of fabric and let out the faintest little bark. To my surprise, the corners of the stranger's mouth lifted into the smallest smile. Even in that freezing morning, after everything that had happened, his first expression was not fear. It was relief that the puppies were alive. Before I could ask his name, the distant sound of approaching sirens drifted across the snow-covered valley, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to believe that all 5 lives beside that frozen river might make it home. The ambulance disappeared down the snow-covered highway, just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the heavy winter clouds. I stood alone beside the empty riverbank holding 3 tiny puppies inside my coat, suddenly realizing I had no idea who the stranger was or whether I would ever see him again. One of the paramedics had asked for my name before leaving. Hannah Brooks. I answered while signing a short witness statement with trembling hands. If he wakes up, just tell him the puppies are safe. The paramedic smiled warmly. I will. Then the flashing lights disappeared beyond the trees, leaving only silence behind. By the time I reached my apartment, my 7-year-old daughter, Emma, was already waiting by the front window. The moment she saw the little noses peeking out from my winter coat, she ran to the door before I even found my keys. Mom, she gasped. Are those puppies? I laughed for the first time that morning despite my exhaustion. 3 of them. Emma carefully knelt on the living room rug as I wrapped the tiny animals inside warm towels fresh from the dryer. They immediately curled together beneath the blanket, still shivering, but finally beginning to relax. Can they stay with us? She asked hopefully. I looked around our small apartment. The wallpaper had begun peeling near the kitchen ceiling. The old heater rattled every few minutes. My paycheck from the hotel barely covered rent, groceries, and Emma's school expenses. 3 puppies were probably the last responsibility we could afford. Yet watching them sleep peacefully after everything they had survived, I could not imagine leaving them anywhere else. Just until we find them good homes, I answered. Emma hugged me tightly. Thank you. Later that afternoon, after changing into dry clothes for my evening cleaning shift, I stopped by the local animal clinic. Dr. Collins examined each puppy carefully before smiling with relief. They are cold and underweight, but they are stronger than they look. Emma proudly helped feed them from tiny bottles while I completed the paperwork. Before leaving, I quietly asked the receptionist whether anyone had called asking about a man rescued from the river that morning. She shook her head apologetically. No, but the county hospital is only a few miles away. On my lunch break the next day, I gathered enough courage to stop there. A nurse checked the admissions list before looking back at me with a polite smile. The patient you described was transferred yesterday afternoon. Transferred where? She lowered her voice. I am sorry. I cannot share that information. I thanked her anyway and walked back outside feeling strangely disappointed. I told myself it should not matter. He was a stranger. I had done what anyone should have done. Life would simply return to normal. Or at least I believed it would. 3 mornings later, while I was sweeping the front steps of the Riverside Inn before guests arrived, a sleek black sedan quietly pulled into the parking lot. Then another, and another. By the time the 4th vehicle stopped, Every employee near the entrance had paused to watch. Men in dark tailored suits stepped out one by one, scanning the area with calm professionalism before opening the rear passenger door of the final car. A tall man wearing a charcoal overcoat slowly stepped onto the snow-covered pavement. His gray eyes met mine from across the parking lot. Even before he smiled, I recognized the stranger I had pulled from the freezing river, but everything else about him was completely different from the helpless man I remembered. As he began walking toward me, every person around us instinctively stepped aside, and I suddenly realized I had never really known who I had rescued. Every conversation around the hotel in trance faded into the background as the stranger stopped a few feet in front of me. Up close, he looked healthier than he had beside the frozen river, yet there was something unmistakably powerful about him now that had been hidden beneath the icy water and soaked clothes. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly across broad shoulders, and the dark leather gloves in his hands looked expensive without trying to impress anyone. The faint edge of a tattoo disappeared beneath the cuff of his sleeve when he reached into his pocket. "Miss Brooks," he said in a calm, steady voice. "I have been looking for you." I blinked in surprise. "You know my name?" A faint smile crossed his face. "The paramedics told me before I was transferred." He paused for a brief moment, as though choosing his next words carefully. "My name is Adrian Moretti." Before I could answer, one of my coworkers quietly leaned closer and whispered, "Do you know who that is?" I shook my head. Her eyes widened. "Everybody does." The sentence meant nothing to me, but the expressions on the faces around us changed immediately. Hotel guests glanced toward Adrian before quickly looking away. Employees who had been carrying luggage suddenly became unusually quiet. Even the hotel manager stepped outside, greeting Adrian with respectful politeness that bordered on nervousness. Adrian noticed my confusion and gently motioned toward a nearby bench overlooking the snowy street. "May I have a few minutes of your time?" I looked at the clock above the entrance. My shift would not begin for another 15 minutes. "All right." We sat down while the line of black vehicles remained parked silently along the curb. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Adrian reached into his coat and carefully placed a small velvet box on the bench between us. "You saved my life," he said. "I can never repay that debt, but I would like to try." I opened the box just enough to glimpse an elegant wristwatch resting inside. It looked far more expensive than anything I had ever owned. I immediately closed the lid and pushed it gently back toward him. "I cannot accept this." He looked genuinely surprised. "Why not?" I smiled politely. "Because I did not rescue you for a reward." His gray eyes searched my face as though trying to understand an answer he rarely heard. Most people would have accepted it. "Maybe," I replied softly, "but I already received what mattered." He glanced toward me with quiet curiosity. "What was that?" I reached into my phone and showed him a photograph I had taken the previous evening. Emma sat on the living room floor laughing while the three puppies chased one another across an old blanket. Adrian studied the picture much longer than I expected. The serious expression he carried so naturally softened almost immediately. "They are beautiful," he whispered. "They are alive," I answered. "That is enough." He smiled in a way that looked almost unfamiliar, as though it had been years since someone had reminded him that simple things could still matter. "Is there truly nothing you need?" he asked again. I thought for a moment before answering honestly. "Actually, there is one thing." His attention sharpened immediately. "Name it." I looked back at the puppies in the photograph and then met his eyes again. "Help me find a safe place where they can stay together. I do not want them separated." Adrian stared at me for several silent seconds before slowly nodding. "Out of everything you could have asked for." He looked toward the snowy sky and quietly smiled. "You chose them." In that moment, I saw something shift behind his eyes, and although I still did not understand the world he came from, I realized he was no longer thinking about repaying a debt. He was trying to understand the woman who had valued 3 abandoned puppies more than anything money could buy. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I had not realized I had been missing. Every Saturday morning, Emma and I drove to the rescue farm with a basket of homemade muffins or fresh apples from the local market. The 3 puppies grew stronger with every visit, their tiny paws becoming steady as they raced across the fields together. Walter and June greeted us like family, and somehow Adrian was almost always there before we arrived. Sometimes he repaired fences with Walter. Other times he carried heavy bags of animal feed or quietly brushed one of the rescued horses while Emma followed him from one shore to the next, asking endless questions about everything she saw. To my surprise, he answered every single one with remarkable patience. The stories I had overheard about Adrian never mentioned this side of him. They never spoke about the man who knelt in the mud to comfort an injured puppy or spent 20 minutes building a tiny wooden bridge across a puddle because Emma worried the smallest dog might be afraid to cross it. One bright Saturday afternoon, we finished repairing a flower bed near the farmhouse porch. I looked down at my worn gardening gloves and laughed softly. I came here planning to visit 3 puppies. Somehow, I ended up planting roses. Adrian smiled while wiping a bit of dirt from his hands. The roses needed help too. Emma suddenly called from the other side of the yard. "Mom, look." We turned together just in time to see all 3 puppies racing toward us with joyful energy, each carrying a small stick much too large for its tiny mouth. Adrian laughed openly, the sound warm and genuine. It was the kind of laugh that reached his eyes. I realized I had never seen him smile that freely before. "They have decided we are part of their pack," he said. "I think that is a compliment." Emma ran over and wrapped both arms around his waist without hesitation. "Then you are part of ours too." Adrian froze for only a heartbeat before gently hugging her back with one arm. The tenderness in that simple embrace caught me completely off guard. He looked toward me almost uncertain, as though wondering whether he had crossed an invisible line. Instead of pulling Emma away, I simply smiled. "She does not hug people she does not trust." His expression softened. That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever told me. Later that afternoon, we sat together on the farmhouse porch while the puppies slept in a patch of warm sunlight beside our feet. Walter and June had gone inside to prepare fresh lemonade, leaving only the gentle breeze, the sound of birds, and the distant rustle of leaves. Adrian stared across the open fields before speaking quietly. "I spent years believing people stayed close because they wanted something from me." He paused, watching one puppy twitch happily in its sleep. "Then you jumped into freezing water for someone you had never met." I looked down at my hands. "I did not think about who you were." "Exactly," he replied. "You only thought about who needed help." For a long moment, neither of us said another word. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. As we stood to leave, one of the playful puppies brushed against my legs, causing me to lose my balance for just an instant. Adrian reached out instinctively and caught my hand before I could stumble. Our eyes met, and neither of us let go right away. There was no dramatic confession, no grand gesture, only a quiet understanding that had grown one ordinary day at a time. When we finally walked back toward the farmhouse, our hands separated naturally, but the warmth of that brief touch remained with me long after the sun slipped below the trees, leaving me with the unexpected feeling that sometimes the safest place in the world was simply beside someone who had learned to value kindness as much as I did. By early spring, the rescue farm had become more than a weekend destination. It had quietly become the place where all of us breathed a little easier. Emma counted the days until Saturday. Walter insisted we stay for lunch whether we planned to or not, and June always packed homemade cookies before we left, pretending she had baked too many. The 3 puppies had nearly doubled in size, racing through the fields with endless energy before collapsing together beneath the old maple tree as though they had never known fear. Watching them grow reminded me that healing rarely happened all at once. It arrived one ordinary day after another until you suddenly realized life no longer felt the way it once had. One afternoon, I arrived earlier than usual because my cleaning shift had ended ahead of schedule. The farm was unusually quiet. Emma had stayed after school for a science project, leaving me alone for the first time in weeks. I found Adrian sitting on the weathered dock beside the small lake at the edge of the property. The water had completely thawed since winter, reflecting the bright blue sky above us. He skipped a small stone across the surface before noticing me. "I was wondering if you would come today," he said with a gentle smile. I sat beside him, leaving just enough space between us for comfort. The puppies would never forgive me if I missed a visit. He laughed softly. Neither would Walter. We watched the ripples spread across the lake without speaking. The silence felt familiar now, never awkward. After several minutes, I asked the question that had quietly followed me for weeks. "People around town seem to know your name." Adrian nodded once. "They do. They also seem afraid of it." He looked toward the distant hills before answering. Sometimes people only remember the hardest chapters of someone's life. They rarely stay long enough to read the rest of the story. His honesty caught me off guard. There was no attempt to defend himself or change the subject. Only quiet acceptance. "Does it bother you?" I asked. He thought carefully before replying. "It used to. Then a woman pulled me out of freezing water without asking who I was first." I smiled, looking down at my hands. "I only saw someone who needed help." "Exactly," he said. "You gave me something I had forgotten existed." I turned toward him. "What was that?" His gray eyes met mine with complete sincerity. The chance to be known before being judged. Before I could answer, Emma's cheerful voice echoed across the field. She came running toward us with all 3 puppies chasing happily behind her. "You have to see this," she called. Walter and June followed at a slower pace, carrying a picnic basket and waving us toward the large oak tree. We spent the afternoon sharing sandwiches, fresh lemonade, and stories while the puppies tumbled through the grass. At one point, Emma carefully braided tiny wildflowers into one puppy's collar until everyone laughed. Adrian watched the simple scene with an expression I had never seen before. Peace. As the sun began setting behind the hills, Emma leaned sleepily against my shoulder. Adrian quietly draped his light jacket around both of us without saying a word. I looked at him with grateful eyes, and he simply smiled as though caring for us had become the most natural thing in the world. In that quiet golden light, I realized the strongest promise anyone had ever made to me had not been spoken aloud. It had been shown through every small act of kindness, every shared Saturday, every patient smile, and every moment Adrian chose to stay when he no longer owed us anything at all. As spring slowly gave way to early summer, the little rescue farm seemed to grow brighter with every passing week. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. Birds nested beneath the farmhouse roof, and the 3 puppies, no longer frightened or fragile, greeted every visitor with joyful energy that made even the busiest mornings feel lighter. Emma insisted on giving each of them a proper name. Sunny because he always chased the sunlight. River because that was where we had found him. Brave because she believed courage deserved to be remembered forever. Walter laughed every time Emma introduced them to new visitors as though they were honored members of the family. I realized she was not joking. They truly were. One warm Saturday morning, Adrian arrived carrying a small wooden toolbox instead of his usual backpack. Emma immediately ran to meet him. "What are we building today?" she asked excitedly. Adrian smiled. "That depends. Do you think 3 energetic puppies deserve a bigger playground?" Emma gasped with delight before grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the open field behind the farmhouse. Walter had already marked a wide section of land where new fencing would be installed together with shaded resting areas and a small wooden bridge crossing a shallow stream. Everyone found something to do. Walter measured fence posts while June planted lavender near the entrance. Emma carefully painted bright paw prints onto little wooden signs. I helped assemble flower boxes beside the benches, and Adrian quietly worked beside me, tightening each board with patient precision. Every now and then our hands reached for the same tool at exactly the same moment. We would smile, laugh softly, and continue working without either of us feeling the need to fill every silence with conversation. Around lunchtime, we sat beneath the old maple tree, sharing homemade sandwiches while the puppies chased butterflies through the grass. Emma watched them for a long moment before turning toward Adrian with complete seriousness. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Anything." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "When people save someone, do they only save them once?" Adrian looked surprised by the question. "Why do you ask?" Emma pointed first toward the puppies, then toward me, and finally toward him. "Because I think Mom saved you in the river, but now you keep saving us by coming back every weekend." Adrian grew very quiet. He looked at me before answering Emma gently. "Sometimes people rescue each other in different ways." Emma seemed satisfied with that explanation and returned to feeding tiny pieces of bread to the ducks near the pond. I remained still, unable to stop thinking about her words. They carried a simple truth adults often overlooked. Adrian had never tried to change our lives with expensive gifts or dramatic promises. Instead, he repaired broken fences, planted gardens, carried heavy boxes, helped Emma with school projects, and made certain 3 abandoned puppies always had a safe place to sleep. Those ordinary moments had quietly become extraordinary. As the afternoon sun began settling lower across the fields, Walter stepped back to admire the finished playground. The puppies raced across the little bridge, through the open grass, and around the flower beds as though they had discovered paradise. Adrian stood beside me watching them with a peaceful smile. Without thinking, I slipped my hand into his. He looked down in gentle surprise before carefully intertwining his fingers with mine. Neither of us spoke. We simply stood together beneath the warm summer sky while Emma laughed in the distance, and 3 happy dogs ran freely across the place where hope had quietly found all of us. 1 year later, the river no longer looked frightening. Summer sunlight danced across the gentle current where thick sheets of ice had once covered the water, and wildflowers lined the walking trail that Emma and I now visited almost every weekend. The old bridge still stood exactly where it always had, but every time I crossed it, I remembered the freezing morning that had quietly changed the direction of our lives. Walter and June had organized a small picnic beside the rescue farm to celebrate the puppies' first birthday since they had been saved. Sunny, River, and Brave were no longer tiny, frightened animals hiding inside my winter coat. They raced confidently across the open fields, chasing one another through the tall grass before returning to greet every visitor with wagging tails and joyful excitement. Emma insisted they each deserved their own birthday treat, and June happily baked special dog-friendly cakes while laughing that she had never hosted such an unusual celebration before. Friends from the town, volunteers from the rescue farm, and several families who had adopted animals over the past year gathered beneath colorful string lights hanging from the old maple tree. There were no expensive decorations, no formal speeches, only laughter, homemade food, and people grateful for second chances. Adrian stood beside Walter repairing the last loose board on the little bridge we had built months earlier. His sleeves were rolled above his forearms, revealing the familiar tattoos that no longer seemed intimidating to me. They had become simply another part of the man who spent Saturday mornings planting flowers, helping children feed rescued animals, and making certain everyone around him felt safe. Emma ran toward him carrying 3 bright ribbons. Birthday medals, she announced proudly before tying one around each puppy's collar. Adrian knelt beside her, applauding as though they had just won an important championship. Watching the two of them together filled my heart with a quiet peace I had not believed possible after so many years of raising my daughter alone. As evening settled over the fields, Walter tapped his glass gently to gather everyone's attention. "A year ago," he said with a warm smile, 3 little puppies and 1 stranger were given another chance because one courageous woman refused to walk away. Every face turned toward me, and I immediately felt my cheeks grow warm. Before I could protest, Adrian stepped forward. He looked at the crowd for only a moment before turning toward me. "Walter forgot one part of the story," he said softly. "She did not only save lives that morning. She reminded someone who had forgotten how to live that kindness is stronger than fear, and that family can begin with one selfless decision." The quiet that followed felt wonderfully peaceful. Adrian reached for my hand the same way he had done beneath the summer sky weeks earlier. Only this time, he did not let go. Emma smiled from beside the puppies, looking happier than I had ever seen her. "Mom," she whispered, "I think this is your happy ending." I looked at Adrian, then at Emma, then at the 3 joyful dogs racing through the grass with complete freedom. "No," I answered gently. "I think this is our beginning." Adrian's eyes softened before he leaned forward and placed a tender kiss on my forehead, followed by a gentle kiss that spoke more through kindness than words ever could. Around us, everyone quietly returned to their conversations as though respecting a moment that belonged only to us. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the hills, painting the sky with shades of gold and rose, while the river continued flowing peacefully in the distance. I realized then that miracles rarely arrive the way people imagined. Sometimes they came disguised as frightened puppies, a stranger in freezing water, and a single choice to stop, to care, and to reach out a helping hand. Everything beautiful that followed began with that one simple moment, proving that the greatest lives are often built not by extraordinary power, but by ordinary kindness shared without expecting anything in return.